Choose Self-Storage, conveniently located near the Harmon McDonald's. We offer affordable rates, online payments, and auto bill pay for your convenience. Plus gate access daily from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Call us today at 648-7867 for more information.
Half a day, and welcome to Group Chat. Coming at you with the Director of the Commission on Decolonization, of course, Melvin Won Pat-Borja. Remember, we're doing a 4-part series discussing decolonization, and a great first episode, man. And I know we kind of went a little bit down the status quo rabbit hole, but yeah. I mean, you know, once you start talking about that, it could just take on a life of its own. So I guess we are just going to talk about status quo. And I mean, you know, first of all, why isn't, and I know the answer to these questions already, we're just kind of playing a little devil's advocate here, but why isn't status quo an option when we talk about decolonization?
So the status quo really is what establishes the need for decolonization. You know, I think the important thing first is that we have to understand what the status quo is and what it really means for our community, for our level of self-governance, for our level of autonomy and sovereignty over our island. And so when we think about, you know, what is the reality around our unincorporated territorial status, you know, it creates an environment where there are clear disadvantages, clear deficiencies, there are clear examples of how the United States is able to unilaterally control the government of Guam, and you know, we're just kind of play victim to it. And so I think it's through our historical relationship with the status quo and how we've managed to kind of work around some of the deficiencies, or you know, just kind of take some of these losses on the chin, we've come to a place where, you know, we've established that the status quo is just not good enough anymore. And so when we talk about decolonization and self-determination, the whole point is to change the status. And so even in discussing the status quo, one of the things I think is really important that I mentioned in the last show is that even if the people of Guam were to include status quo on a plebiscite and to overwhelmingly choose status quo, that is not an act of self-determination in and of itself, because the status quo is a colonial status. It is a non-self-governing status. That's the whole reason why we are on this list of non-self-governing territories recognized by the United Nations. So
right.
In other words,
and so just real quick, how many other territories?
There's 17, including us.
Right, and so I think another way to explain it is kind of that this you know, era, I mean, as far back as 100 years, it's been determined that, you know, colonies are not an acceptable
right.
Thing for, you know, a lot of these big nations administering powers, and so that's kind of where self-determination comes from, is that everyone around the world says, hey, it's not really fair to have colonies.
Right, after the end of World War II, when the United Nations really came together and started to assert these ideals, that was one of the things that came out of that conversation, right? Is after experiencing this global conflict and, you know, this tragedy from the dropping of the atomic bombs, you know, in Japan, the global community, international community, came to a place where they basically said, look, we don't want to have another world war. And among that, within that conversation, obviously they discussed things like nuclear disarmament, but they also discussed, you know, the impact that colonialism has on the world. And they established that, you know, this is not conducive to world peace.
Right.
And so during that era, a lot of nations, most of the sovereign nations of the world became sovereign nations of the world through that process. And really, when we look at who is left, these 17 non-self-governing territories that include Guam, we are literally behind everyone else in the world. Everyone else in the world has determined what they want their political status to be. Some of them chose to become sovereign, independent nations. Some of them chose to freely associate with another nation. Some of them chose to fully integrate with, you know, another nation. And so either way, if we were to choose whatever status we chose, be it free association, independence, or integration, those are the only three statuses that are recognized by the international community that would relieve a jurisdiction of a colonial rule, a colonial
right.
system. And so even if we were to choose status quo in a plebiscite, all we would be asserting is that we are not ready yet to choose a permanent status. So just by saying, if we were to choose, we want to remain status quo, all we're doing is extending the life of the conversation. All we're doing is saying, look, we want more time to develop our economy, or we want more time to educate our community, and then we will decide on a permanent status. So in other words, even though we could choose status quo, but status quo would not be the end of the discussion. It would
Right.
just prolong it. And so I think that that's where we're at right now, is that we've established that we do not want the status quo. I mean, the status quo was voted down during the Commonwealth era. People chose Commonwealth over the status quo. And so, I think that kind of establishes the baseline
Right.
of where our community is at and what our needs are.
And it's probably fear of the unknown that
Yeah, I think
people don't. I mean, we all know people don't like change and
right,
status
change is
quo,
scary,
so
absolutely.
people don't know what to expect other than the status quo. But
Right.
there are things that I feel can be really improved upon if we move away from the status quo.
Oh,
There's-
definitely, definitely. I think that that's an important part of the conversation, and that's something that we've really tried to be deliberate about with the commission, is that we have to include the education of the current status as part of our approach. We can't just say, look, this is what decolonization is, this is how it'll benefit us. We need to also be able to say, look, this is what is happening to us now, and this is why decolonization is important. This is the impact that decolonization can have on a community. Now, our role is not to get into the weeds of every particular status and how that affects us. Our job really is to advocate for a change in status.
Right.
So whether it be free association, independent statehood, we are advocating to change and get away from this dependent status, this
Which
colonial
is kind
status.
of crazy that people would bring up status quo when, again, like we said in the first show, the whole point of decolonization
Right.
is that we're a colony and we're trying to not be a colony.
Right, and I think that there's a lot of nuance in the discussion. I
Yeah.
think a lot of people kind of get caught up in the interpretation of the concepts. But what I like about this particular discussion is that we don't have to get caught up in the interpretation, because the definitions are pretty black and white.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? An unincorporated territory is a very clear assertion of what our political limitations are. One of my favorite speeches from Governor Joseph F. Adat was when he said in his it was a conference in Washington D.C., and he did the opening remarks, and he introduced himself by saying, "Hafide, my name is Governor Joseph F. Adat. I am the governor of the American colony of Guam." And then he says, "That's right, the American colony of Guam. Let's call it what it is. Let's not engage. Let's not like invest in the fallacy that it could be something else." And he basically says that the colonial status, that the territorial status is the colonial status. We have to accept and acknowledge that it is a colony.
Right.
And that's the thing, is that by definition of a colony, an unincorporated territorial status fits that definition. There is no argument about it. It's not up for debate. We cannot say, well, it's only a colony if you look at it this way. Right. It is what it is. We recognize that we don't have meaningful representation in this current system. You cannot argue that we are self-governing without meaningful representation.
Right.
So I think that's and furthermore, I think it's important too to recognize that yes, there have been assertions by federal officials that status quo should be a part of the process, that status quo should be an option. But it's nowhere in their policy, nowhere in United States law policy does it say that we have to have status quo. Now, on top of that, we have to recognize that currently our law is going to be funded, the plebiscite will be funded with government of Guam funds. It's not using federal funds.
Mm-hmm.
And so that in itself kind of changes the parameters, and we are not subject to their whims. You know what I mean? And I think that the government of Guam has engaged in this way deliberately because we've seen how this is
Right.
affected or is kind of influenced in other places. Like Puerto Rico, for example. There was an assertion that because Puerto Rico did not include status quo, that led to the demise of their plebiscite, which is not entirely true. Because what it was that their plebiscite, the plebiscite in question that time was being funded using federal money. And so the Department of Justice kind of pushed back and said, look, if you're going to use federal money, then we want status quo included.
Right. Yeah.
And that's their prerogative for sure. But we're not in that same situation exactly. You know what I mean? The federal government doesn't really have a place to say, hey, you have to do it this way.
Right.
Now, obviously, we still have to negotiate with the federal government, but we're not at that stage yet. I think that even if you look at the current plebiscite law, it's a non-binding plebiscite. It's not. It doesn't hold them responsible to act on the results.
It's kind of like a litmus test. So we do it, and then we say, okay, this is what Chamorros want.
It's our way of being able to say, look, our community has spoken. Our community has asserted this is what we want for our political future, something that we haven't done for 500 years. And here it is. Here's our decision. Now, once we have that, then that's when the entire community needs to get behind it, and we need to advocate for these negotiations to take place. So whatever it is that we choose, be it an integrated model, a freely associated model, an independent model, that's going to be the assertion that we're going to put forward, and that's the stance that our government will then take. And that's the thing that I think is important too about the conversation, is that even when we talk about like the native inhabitant vote, the native inhabitant vote only really applies to the exercise of the voice. What do the colonized people of Guam want for their political future? Now, that being said, once they establish that, we can't realistically just leave everybody out of that process, because that too is a process, right? Because even let's just take independence, which is probably the most extreme of the three models. Independence doesn't necessarily mean that we're just going to have no relationship with the U.S. It could mean that, but it could also mean a much closer relationship to the U.S. And that's something that will have to be negotiated by our entire community. So if, let's just say, for example, the community asserts that we want to be an independent nation, what will then have to happen is that everybody in the community, including the government and your lay citizen, will have to come together and say, okay, this is the model of independence that we want. And that's what we're going to debate. Some people will say we want to kind of move away from the U.S. and some people will say, no, we want to get closer to the U.S. And that's the point where the government is going to have to kind of figure out, okay, where do we stand and what do we want to assert in these negotiations? Now, obviously, that has to move on to the next stage where
still a little bit away.
Yeah, we're still a long way from that. But I think that that's the important piece, right? Is that everybody has a place in this conversation. It's just happening in stages.
So I think what is also a good way to kind of enlighten people more about the status quo is taking an example of something in the status quo and how it maybe handicaps us economically or politically, and then describing how under the other options that thing, whatever it may be, would be different.
That's a great example, and I'm glad you brought that up, because a lot of times when we talk about the status quo, we're in a place where we have become so comfortable and complacent, and a lot of it is to no fault of our own. This is a system that we've really embraced and that we've really tried our best to make we try to make good based on the reality. Now, if we look, let's say for example, we take our let's say we take our housing. This is one of my favorite ones. To me, at the heart of decolonization it's about us reimagining, re-envisioning the systems that we know don't work and creating new ones that do. Now, we clearly have seen that we cannot take this cookie cutter model handed down from the feds and just apply it and expect it to work. It was not built for us. It was not built with us in mind. And so we see different models of this and how they are unsuccessful in our community. For example, GURA housing, right? Section 8 housing. In the U.S. Urban Code, it does not permit for residents to grow plants, right? You can't grow plants in your flower bed if you stay in a Section 8 house. Now, most of I would say almost 100% of our residents who are, staying in Section 8 are also food stamp recipients, right? Wouldn't it lend to our system of sustainability if we also made it a requirement to stay in a Section 8 house that you had to start growing some amount of your own food?
Sure.
Maybe just a tomato plant or, some herbs in your garden or whatever, right? But those regulations forbid that. And so decolonization, in my opinion, is about us reimagining those systems. It's about us being able to say, look, we are sovereign here in our island, and we know that this doesn't work. So we want to reimagine, re-envision ways that we could make it work. Same thing goes with, let's take the military buildup, for example. Obviously, there are some benefits to the military buildup, right? But what's happening, the reason why it's so problematic for us is, at this stage, is because we are not involved in the negotiations of said agreement. Right?
Yeah.
We just kind of weigh in from time to time. Same thing goes with like the Compact of Free Association, right? We always talk about compact impact. And the impact of the compacts of a free association are very clear, very tangible for our community. But at no point have we ever negotiated how those compacts will work. Even now, when the freely associated states are negotiating a new compact, we're still absent from those negotiations. We are being represented by our administering power.
It's funny that the people who observe this process of the renegotiation for the FSM, it really seems like the U.S. government is rolling out the red carpet.
Oh yeah.
For these islands, and when I look at that, I just see that, wow, if we had the same authority to negotiate from a position of strength, then we could see a lot of the same.
Oh, absolutely, and I think that that's something that is really important for our community to come to terms with. A lot of times when you talk to people in a community, we have this sense of superiority over the other Micronesian islands. We have this idea that, oh, Guam we're so far ahead. We're so developed, we're so modernized. Look at all this stuff we have. You know what I mean? But the stuff is nothing. You know what I mean? What really is important to me is, where are we politically? Because politically, we're light years behind. Politically, these guys are over here they're calling the shots. They are leveraging real political power.
Right.
Let me give you an example. The governor was telling us about this experience she had going out to the Micronesian Islands Forum in Chuuk. And at this gathering, right, during the opening remarks, every leader was giving remarks, right? And every leader from every Micronesian government gave props to China. And DOI was there. The Assistant Secretary of DOI was there, right? Doug Dominich. And so the governor says to Doug Dominich, she says, "Hey, Doug, have you noticed something?" She said, every islander, every leader here gave props to China. Every single one of them. You know who they didn't give props to? They didn't say anything about the United States. And he says, "Oh yeah, it's noted, Governor. We took note." And she's like, "Well, you better do better than take notes. You better step your game up." Right? And the reason why I bring this up is because these guys it's not an accident.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They recognize the political climate. They recognize that China is making moves economically all over the region.
And China sees it too. They see that
absolutely.
these guys are kind of in a gray area. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I've traveled around Micronesia. You see it where they do things. It's called soft diplomacy.
Yeah.
Where they give money for community development. They, build bridges and
invest in schools. Invest in healthcare.
Even as close as the CNMI, we have Chinese influence.
Absolutely. And see, now on the surface, people will see this and think to themselves, "Oh, well, I don't want to decolonize because I'm not trying to be Chinese. I'm not trying to have a relationship with China." But that's not the point. It's not about China. The point is that these nations are sovereign nations who have the opportunity to leverage the political climate. They have an opportunity to say, "Look, we know that China and the United States have this political conflict. They're in this political power struggle. And so what are we going to do? We're going to take advantage. We're going to say, look, either you're going to play ball with us and you're going to treat us with dignity and negotiate with us, or we're going to go and negotiate with someone else."
We got a comment here from June. What does it mean to take the time to educate our community? The generations look at status quo so differently. And how do we really listen to each other as we discuss this reality? I think, and she's writing from El Cerrito, California.
Yeah,
It's a good point. I think the older generation, they just can't, maybe some of the mind just won't allow for new concepts.
I think that our older generation is experiencing something very unique, in the sense that they lived through a very traumatic period in Guam's history that resulted in like this hyper patriotism. And there's I don't see any fault in that. These are people who literally experienced the atrocities of war and didn't want to the extreme. And so, that generation has a very clear sense of loyalty to the United States despite the situation. Despite the fact that, more people died in one day of US bombing than in the entire 3-year Japanese occupation. You know, and so, but that doesn't change the fact
But
that
you couldn't
it
go
was-
tell Tanana.
Right, you can't tell
she would
Tanana
just
that
be like,
because
"What?"
Tanana is the one who saw the
Yeah.
atrocities firsthand. It was personal at that point. And so, but what we're seeing now is that a lot of this generation has experienced this such a high level of discrimination despite their loyalty, and they've come to a place where they're at the end of their lives.
Yeah.
They're at the end of their lives. They spent their entire lives trying to be equal. Their entire lives trying to be treated with dignity and respect. And what they've seen is that we have never been able to break through the second-class citizen glass ceiling. And so, on one side, you have a disheartened, kind of disappointed and upset, angry, bitter generation. And then on the other side, you have a generation that's, for all intents and purposes, viewing this from a very objective standpoint. You know, they're kind of like, before, back in the day, like when I was a kid and we would have this conversation, the shut it down moment was when the elder would be like, you know, boy, if it wasn't for the Americans, you'd be speaking Japanese. And that was the end of the conversation. You know what I mean? Like, is that what you want? You want to speak Japanese? You try to say that to a young person now, and they're like, so what are you?
Konnichiwa.
So what are you saying? You saying that I'm gonna have like the best cell phones in the world, and I'm gonna have like socialized, you know, healthcare and, you know, education and all that.
Right,
You know, their
yeah.
perspective has really changed, and I
It
think
is,
that
but I don't think there's going to be another event that like World War II, like an occupation in
Right.
Guam, that we're going to see those emotions triggered in a younger generation. I think that's just a different time. It's kind of
it is. But
I mean,
we
obviously
are.
it's an
But
anomaly.
I think that what's cool about this is that we are coming to a place where we're starting to see that the political dynamic is changing. You know what I mean? The United States is not like the almighty superpower that it once was. I mean, even America's economy is in the pits right now. They're billions of dollars in debt. You know what I mean? There's so many other nations that are doing much better economically. And so I think that we're starting to see that there are a lot of opportunities out there. And we're also starting to see that the world that we know is changing rapidly. It's not just a handful of, you know, really powerful countries that are kind of calling the shots, but instead it's a collaboration of all of these little independent nations or sovereign nations that are engaged in a system of interdependence, right? Where they recognize, look, I can't survive in the world alone. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage in relationships with all these different countries. I mean, even the United States itself has recognized that the only way for them to survive is to engage in diplomacy, to engage in, you know, mutually beneficial relationships between themselves and other nations. And so we are starting to see that, and we are starting to recognize that we have to step up and we have to figure out how can we become major players in a global economy? How can we become, you know, viable assets in the global market, and how can we
not by
sustain
being
our
a
lives?
colony.
Right, definitely not by being a colony. I mean, this is the way I think about it, is that we are so valuable to the United States military for our strategic location, right? We hear this all the time. Guam is so important. I mean, they fought 2 wars to keep Guam. But the problem I see is that we don't value ourselves and our potential in the same way that the United States values it. If we are really the peace, the gateway to the Pacific for the United States for war, can we not be the same gateway for the Pacific for trade, for economy, you know what I mean, for technology, for education, for healthcare? I mean, think about how many people come to Guam just to go to school. You know what I mean? Just because there's a university here
Right.
that's solid.
Yeah.
I mean, educational tourism is a real source of economy. You know what I mean? I think that that's something that we could really capitalize on, but we are not invested in our economy in that way. And we can really create, you know, things that make more sense. I mean, think about like the Jones Act, for example, which is a very colonial construct,
Right,
really
yeah.
just built to protect American jobs. But all it does for us is raise the cost of living, the cost of goods.
And I think that's where like a good place to build the argument. I mean, and again, I personally feel like we're wasting a lot of time on the status quo, and it's not an option. But the Jones Act is probably the biggest.
Right.
I think one of the biggest
It
reasons
is.
why we need to decolonize.
Oh, absolutely. The Jones Act is so crippling for us. I mean, somebody did a study on Puerto Rico that said that, like, if the Jones Act was dissolved, that Puerto Rico could absolve its national debt in a matter of years.
Wow.
You know, I mean, just in the money that it would save. I mean, it's crazy. It's like upwards of billions of dollars.
$1.29 onions.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
just think about like where we're getting our food from. When we're
Right,
shipping
yeah.
food from California or from Hawaii, it doesn't make any sense when the Asian market is just right next door.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? The Australian market, the New Zealand market is just right next door. It makes sense economically for us to tap into those markets.
And
but
I
we're
think
not.
those are arguments that really hit people where the pocketbook is, and I think
Oh, yeah,
like
absolutely.
economically, right? So if I could, buy an orange in the grocery store here, then I could go to the Philippines, and it's like a third of the cost.
Yep.
Or whatever. I mean, it just kind of. Anyway, Mel, I think we've kind of beat that status quo horse
right.
a little more.
Yeah, I'm with it.
Yeah. And so, what are we looking at for our next discussion? Are we that far ahead?
Yeah, well, what I would really like us to think about is trying to get into some of the weeds of this discussion. So, our conference, our Fanhita conference, is airing.
Right.
The rebroadcast has been airing panel by panel. I thought it would be great for us to try to dig into some more topic-based discussion.
Yeah.
So, what we're gonna do next episode is that we'll try to focus on one of the panels that has already aired, so that people can have an opportunity to view the panel and then really unpack some of the statements. And
Right.
so one of the things I'm happy about with the rebroadcast of the conference is that during the conference, while it was live, we were pulling panelists to the side and running these sideline interviews and really trying to get them to unpack some of their statements. And so those interviews are going to be peppered into the rebroadcast. So even if you were there at the conference, there's still some new content that is available on the rebroadcast. And so I like the idea of recording and rebroadcasting the conference, because not everybody can make it out of work to get there.
Right.
And so, but there's still a lot of really important information. And so having it available on our website, on our social media, is a really great resource, because you get an opportunity to really sit down and, go through it and pick it
Right.
apart. And it becomes a central focus for any dinner table conversation. Is something that allows us to continue to elevate, this dialogue, and to continue to explore these ideas and get in, engage in discourse. I think
Right.
that's the most important thing that we can do right now.
Totally agree. So, again, if you couldn't make it to the Fanhita conference, we're bringing it to you guys, and it's on all your social media. YouTube. You
Yeah,
guys
it's
got
on
a
our YouTube channel. It's archived on the YouTube channel. So every time PBS airs an episode, they archive it on our website, and it's also mirrored on the PBS YouTube as well.
There you go. So, hey, next episode we're gonna kind of take some of these panelists and look at the things they said, and hopefully get some more great discussion on decolonization. Mel, it's always a pleasure, man, to have you. Thanks, and hey, we're doing this a little early, right, Jay?
Mm-hmm.
We're doing it early because tomorrow we got Giving Tuesday. So again, shout out to Mel here for coming out.
There's one final good one.
Oh, so we got a final comment here.
That bear. That's the wrap-up one.
Where's it at?
All the way at the bottom.
Okay, hold on a sec. Yeah, so we're gonna be doing a lot of Giving Tuesday. Here we go. Oh yeah, Bear, my man Bear Kidwell writes, "Keep it up, guys. Information is a powerful tool, Biva," and it really is, man. And I think when you hear people who are speaking from a place of fear, or even a lot of times just negativity, the problem is they just don't know any better. So
Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I just want to give credit to Bear. Bear's one of these people that is is a really great figure in our community, because
Right.
he's somebody who really has created something on his own.
Right.
Something that's been very successful. But what I really appreciate about individuals like Bear is that they really take it upon themselves to extend and expand on the conversation, and to engage in conversation, to engage in dialogue. I think that that's something that we don't do enough. A lot
Right.
of times we get caught up in the bickering and the arguing, and that's cool and all, but I think that if we cannot come from a place where we're willing to kind of hear other people and incorporate their perspectives, and not turn every dialogue into an argument,
Right.
then we're just arguing, and we're just debating, and we're never really expanding and growing. And I like the idea that we can sit down and have a conversation, and we may not agree on everything, but I think that the point is that if the more that we start to flesh out our ideas and explore the possibilities, the more we expand our level of consciousness. And that's so critical for something like this, because it's never cut and dry. And there's no one way to solve a decolonial problem. There's always multiple ways to do it, but you know, if we're not willing to take that step on our own, then we're dead before we started.
Well, there you go. Bear and all you guys, thanks so much for watching our discussions on decolonization. Like Bear said, man, information is key. We'll be bringing you a whole lot more over the next couple episodes. For my man Mel, Guasi Chris, Estadios. Thanks for
Adios.
watching.